I think this ultra-wide gaming monitor is really going to appeal to a lot of individuals. It's called the AOC Agon Pro AG346UCD, which sports a curved 34-inch glossy QD-OLED panel that operates a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate of 175Hz. It's got G-Sync compatibility, AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, and also DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification for that lifelike HDR reproduction. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for just £550, although prices do extend up to £670. Now, in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. So to kick things off, I thought I should point out that this monitor has got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, and therefore will allow you to output the maximum refresh rate and resolution. If, however, you elect to go for the two HDMI 2.0 ports, you'll be capped at 1440p at 100Hz. So some food for thought if you're connecting up, for example, to a laptop or a device that only has HDMI. Now, with that in mind, I went ahead and did my tests via my RTX 3080, which was connected over DisplayPort. And first off, the input lag was absolutely phenomenal. I had no problems whatsoever when it came to registering my mouse inputs in a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike 2. Indeed, input lag is going to be something very important for hardcore gamers, or indeed those people who just want to prioritize the input delay of the monitor. In this respect, I don't think you'll have any sort of problems. Now, with that said, my comments were done with the low input lag mode enabled by the monitor's OSD. If you were to disable this option for any given reason, then you'll find that the input delay does become a little bit higher and therefore can be noticeable in certain scenarios. Now, this is actually quite important, and the reason I actually pointed out the fact that you have to be connected over DisplayPort is because over HDMI at 100Hz, the low input lag mode does become disabled and grayed out. So again, just some food for thought if you're going to be getting this monitor and connecting it over HDMI. Now, with that in mind, it is also worth highlighting that the low input lag mode does become grayed out, however seemingly stays on if you were to enable adaptive sync technologies. In other words, AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Yet again, it just depends in terms of the setup you're going for, but just I thought to share my own experiences. Now, with all that in mind, let's talk about the monitor's response time. And here it's absolutely phenomenal, thanks to the fact that it has got a QD-OLED panel. And using the OSRTD tool in order to get me an objective number, you can see that 175Hz, the percent in window was 100%, which is absolutely fantastic, and the average initial time, which translates to the average G2G that most manufacturers claim, sat at just 0.94 milliseconds. So yes, indeed, this monitor is very snappy, and in terms of the response time, well, it's a non-issue, very much like what I said when it comes to its input lag. Now, as for the overall motion clarity, well, at 175Hz, it's certainly good, although it won't compete with higher refresh rate monitors, nor those monitors out there that actually have motion blur reduction technologies, although I do appreciate the latter is somewhat of a rarity when it comes to OLEDs. So moving swiftly on, let's talk about adaptive sync technologies, which I referenced before. This monitor has got AMD FreeSync Premium Pro and G-Sync compatibility. I actually can certify the latter because I've got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort, I had no sort of black screen issues or major problems while running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. However, very much like other OLED monitors out there on the market, this has got some VR flicker. Now, it's very much noticeable when you do look at it on the camera and therefore the video. However, in the naked eye, it's actually very hard to notice altogether. Furthermore, if you are going to be playing a game, it's even harder to notice. So just something I thought I should share. Now, this actually does bring me on to playing a game such as Destiny 2, because I was able to run it at 1440p at 175Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled and, more importantly, HDR. Now, the HDR reproduction is absolutely phenomenal, and this is thanks to the fact that it's got a QD-OLED panel with that DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification. Now, the True Black 400 mode is denoted by the DisplayHDR mode that can be selected via the monitor's OSD. This gives you a really lifelike reproduction and gives you that fantastic contrast. The colors really do pop as well. If, however, you want much higher peak brightness, therefore going from 400 nits up to roughly 800 to 1000 nits, then you'll want to go on one of the other HDR modes, for example, HDR Peak or HDR Movie. This was not something that I actually overly preferred, despite having much higher brightness, because it just didn't feel that the contrast was as well in comparison to the DisplayHDR True Black 400 mode. But of course, this is quite subjective, so if you do get this monitor, feel free to play with the different modes. Now this monitor really comes to life when you're gaming on PC, but what about when it comes to console gamers? Well, I'm not one myself, however I did put it through its paces, and using the OSRTT tool at 120Hz, I clocked in an average initial time of 1.08 milliseconds, which indeed is very impressive. Similarly, at 60Hz, it came in at just 1.18 milliseconds. So yes, this monitor is actually very responsive, be it if you're running at 120Hz or 60Hz. It's worth noting, however, the motion clarity does decrease in comparison to the maximum refresh rate of 175Hz, and namely at 60Hz it does become a lot more blurry. Again, nothing to be overly surprised about, given the fact that it is running at a lower refresh rate. Now, I would like to point out, for those people with a keen eye and those people who have been paying attention, that this monitor was actually able to run 120Hz at 1440p. And you might be wondering, how on earth is that possible? Because you did say at the beginning of this video that it runs only up to 100Hz over HDMI. Well, it does actually become feasible when you run 2560 by 1440p. Therefore, the monitor actually working well with consoles and therefore accepting a 1440p signal at 120Hz and then giving you a stretched out design on the monitor, therefore giving you almost like a 4:3 stretched look in comparison to a 16:9 image. So it's just something worth considering over here that you might want to look at if you're going to be using this monitor with a console. Now, the monitor's gaming performance is seriously impressive, but what about when it comes to its overall image quality? Now, as a reminder, you have got a curved 34-inch glossy QD-OLED panel. And it's worth mentioning over here that if you have got a window positioned just behind you, you will get a little bit of glare. If, however, you're in a pitch black room, then of course it'll be a non-issue, and that glossy panel might be appreciated by certain individuals that want to get a little bit extra depth, especially when it comes to having that better black reproduction. Now, in terms of the overall color accuracy, there's a dedicated sRGB mode that can be selected via the monitor's OSD. In said mode, and using my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 95.9% and a gamut volume of 103.1%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average LTE sat at just 1.34 with the maximum of 2.54. So yes, indeed, this monitor can be used for serious image or video grading work, at least in the sRGB color space. Now, the tested contrast ratio was infinity to 1, given it is an OLED after all, and the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 5926 Kelvin at 100%. And below you can see how it compares to the Gamma 2.2 standard. Now, it's worth pointing out that if you're not image editing or video grading, specifically in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. For example, by selecting the native preset or indeed the DCI-P3 mode, which can be selected via the monitor's OSD. This will give you a little bit of extra pop on your image and therefore might be appreciated for the vast majority of users. Now, past color performance, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here in the HDR modes, including the peak HDR mode, I recorded up to 864 nits, which is a little bit below what the manufacturer claims. Nonetheless, it's still blindingly bright. In the DisplayHDR mode, it does actually get to 430 nits, which is indeed what is required for the DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification. As for its SDR brightness, it gets up to 241 nits, which is still actually pretty bright, at least in a bright sunlit room, and it does get all the way down to 60 nits, showing good sort of range. Therefore, meaning that if you're going to be using this monitor in a completely pitch black environment, it won't be blindingly bright. Now, past this, when it comes to the overall brightness uniformity, you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board, although I do appreciate it's somewhat panel lottery. In terms of the overall backlight bleed, well, it's completely non-existent because it is an OLED panel. Therefore, you'll get a completely pitch black image even if the monitor is on. Now, so far everything is really impressive about this monitor. However, it's worth considering that it is an OLED after all, and therefore there are certain limitations that you might want to consider, specifically coming from a regular LCD panel, in other words an IPS VA or a TN, which is traditionally used across the industry. Now, first off, we have to talk about the burn-in effect, which is indeed something that plagues every single OLED out there. And thankfully over here, AOC have actually provided you a way of mitigating it. First off, via the monitor's OSD, you have got the likes of pixel orbiting, screensaver, logo protection, boundary dimmer, taskbar dimmer, and thermal protection, all of which can be toggled on, and indeed it is suggested to have these actually operating. Furthermore, you've got an auto warning, which will give you an indication of when you should operate a pixel refresh, and for those who are unaware, a pixel refresh will have to be done every so often. There's a certain amount of limit of how much you can actually ignore the pixel refresh, but thankfully over here it can actually be done when the monitor goes into standby, therefore not giving you any sort of downtime. In case you're wondering, a pixel refresh will take you roughly 2 to 3 minutes to operate, so it's not a massive deal. Now, another thing to consider is the overall fringing effect. For those people who are not aware, this is due to the sub-pixel layout that is slightly different on an OLED panel in comparison to a regular LCD. And as a result means that you might see slight different discoloration or indeed slightly different colors around certain objects or indeed text. This is very much present on older generation OLEDs. However, the modern generation one, specifically for example this curved 1440p QD-OLED, is completely a non-issue, at least in my opinion. Hopefully the images will do it justice and you'll be able to compare and contrast for yourself with some other monitors out there, including my daily driver, which is an LCD IPS panel. Now, moving on from all of this, I would like to mention the overall build quality of the monitor, and here I quite like its three-side borderless design and its curved nature, therefore giving you a little extra bit of immersion on certain games. It's also got a black and dark grey finish to it, which means it's not going to overly stand out in a setup, which I actually quite like. In my case, the triangular stand fits pretty well, at least on my monitor riser. The built-in stand itself is very sturdy and also provides you height, tilt and also swivel adjustments. However, given the monitor is a curved 34-inch ultra-wide, it's no surprise that it can't be rotated. If however this is something that you're looking for, then you can replace the built-in stand via a VESA mount which is provided within the box and therefore allowing you to place it on a multi-monitor setup or indeed a monitor arm. Now, at the back of the monitor you might have noticed an RGB ring, and yes indeed the lights themselves are somewhat redundant, at least in my opinion, because they're not bright enough. Nonetheless, you can fully disable them if you so wish via the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed via a small little joystick button that's found at the back right hand side of the monitor. The monitor's OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and easy to understand, therefore making it quite easy to also navigate. Furthermore, you've got an extension to this via the AOC G menu software, which can be downloaded for free. Here you'll find the same sort of settings and also gives you the ability for checking for firmware updates. Now, for those with a keen eye, you will have noticed that there is a volume setting, and yes, this monitor has got two 8-watt speakers built in, which will suffice for basic music listening or gaming, or indeed for Windows notifications. If however you want better quality playback, I would suggest using a set of bookshelf speakers, a headphone or a DAC. On that note over here, you've got a 3.5mm headphone jack output, which can be useful if you're going to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor. And finally, I should also highlight there are 3 USB Type A ports, one of which is downward facing towards the other display ports, and this also gives you fast charging capabilities, while the other 2 are positioned towards the side of the monitor on the left hand side, making it actually quite easy to access, for example if you want to plug in a USB flash drive. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview. I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. Personally, I really do think it's a good inclusion in the market and goes toe-to-toe with some of its main competitors. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification. All of it would be really greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.